Kino pavasaris. Kovo 18, balandžio 5 dienomis visoje Lietuvoje. Didysis partneris Ergo draudimo grupė. Informaciniai partneriai TV3, 15 min žmonės.
Mūsų karta pirmoji, supratusi, kaip iš lėto kenkiame gamtai. Ir vienintelė, žinanti, kad dar yra laiko ją išsaugoti. Apsaugokime mūsų visų ateitį. Ergo.
Geriausius kino pavasario filmus parodys žiūrimiausia televizija TV3. Šeštadieniais 22:40.
Festivalis Kino pavasaris jūsų namuose. Visus filmus žiūrėkite Telia televizijoje jums patogiu metu. Telia. Įdomiau tik gyvenimas.
Įtraukia nuo pat pirmųjų sekundžių. Vienu prisėdimu abi serijos susivalgė. Kaip lietuviškas tikrai neblogas.
Sveiki, kalbėsime su Bruce LaBruce iš Kanados apie jo naujausią filmą ŠVENTASIS NARCIZAS. So, hi Bruce, very nice that you found time for us.
Oh, my pleasure. I love
And
Lithuania. One of my favorite actors is Lithuanian,
really,
Lawrence Harvey. I mean, classical Hollywood actor, Lawrence Harvey. Yeah. So.
yeah. Um, I was thinking how to start this conversation because Saint Narcisse is so full of everything. It's such a rich and entertaining film, but probably
Oh, thank you.
it's best to start from the idea of interpreting and maybe just revoking the myth of Narcissus. Maybe you could tell what got interested you into this myth.
Well, I mean, I was kind of thinking of other film. I'm very referential, so I'm always referencing other filmmakers, and I was thinking of. I really like modern reinterpretations or contemporary interpretations of classical myths. So something like Jean Cocteau's Orphée, for example, or um, uh, Francois Ozon made a film based on Hansel and Gretel, which is kind of a myth, called Criminal Lovers and things like that. So it was like a modern interpretation of a classical myth, but I said it in the early '70s um, to kind of put it in an era before narcissism became the default kind of sensibility, before narcissism kind of took over the world with like selfies and social media. And so, but the myth itself, about a young man who becomes fixated on his own image, um, is it's universal. It's obviously it's a Greek myth, so it's something that's been um, around for forever. It's part of the human psyche, um, to be kind of the temptation to become, self-absorbed and kind of and kind of solipsistic and just seeing uh, yourself reflected in everything. So um, in the original script, I even had more references to the classical myth because he was actually kind of bisexual, a Narcissus in the myth. He falls in love with or a young boy falls in love with him, and eventually kills himself over the unrequited love. And I also had a character who was based on Echo. Of course, Echo was, also in love with him, and she kind of her love is also unrequited, and she ends up disappearing and just becoming an echo, like a kind of shadow of herself. So the one direct reference I did keep is there's a Narcissus runs into a seer, like a prophet, who's actually a transgender prophet, um, who gives him the famous warning: don't know yourself. If you want to, live a long life, don't know yourself. And which people have tried to interpret, thousands of times what exactly that means. Maybe that too much self knowledge, or certainly too much self absorption, can be detrimental to you. So, and I have that in my version with the transgender prostitute who he runs into on the street and gives him that same warning. Yeah. For me, what the most interesting thing is to relate the Narcissus myth to the current narcissism that permeates culture and social media.
And do you think that this narcissism, I mean, it's an old thing, and probably it runs through the humanity, as you said. But why do you think it is at the peak now? And do you think that it's at the peak? And is it because of the social media or technologies, or I don't know, maybe some other things that came to your mind?
We can call it peak narcissism. We're at now, I think. Well, I mean, technology has a lot to do with it. Basically, the screen, it's interesting in terms of the history of cinema, where the screen, the big screen, the silver screen that movies have always been projected on, especially when they were being all made on film as opposed to digital, was like this reflection, almost like a mirror, or it was a screen that everyone could project, the audience could project their desires onto, could project their own kind of wishes and problems, and it was also kind of a mirror that movies kind of reflected back to people, their own lives, interpreted by filmmakers and artists, and in modern times and more contemporary times, the screen has shrunk and shrunk, and until it became like what we have now. With what I'm holding now is like my shaky phone here, and it's it's like a mirror. I mean, you can, on your camera on your phone, you just press a button and it flips around, and there you are, reflected back to yourself. And so and people are it's a very seductive kind of, almost it's a seductive object to have in your hand all the time. It's almost like a narcotic, where people are fixated on themselves, on their own image. And selfies, the whole selfie phenomenon is bizarre. I mean, if you look at it objectively, and that's also why I set my movie in the 70s, because here you have this character, Dominique, who's only takes Polaroids, photos of himself. And when you look at it from a previous era, it seems like such bizarre behavior. He's walking down the street taking photos of himself and randomly handing them out to people. It's like a madman, someone who's so obsessed with himself. And Irene, the young girl in the script, says he only to her mother, he only takes pictures of himself. Who does that? And of course, the answer is everyone does that now, everyone. So how we got here, I don't know. I mean, there is a certain, I think there's a certain kind of solipsism now where people just fixate on themselves to almost like it's a kind of form of alienation. Social media in some ways provides the illusion of being connected to the entire world and being global, but on another level there's always it's a mediated social interaction. And it's manipulated. Everyone presents not their real selves, but their idealized version of themselves. So it's kind of almost encourages this kind of self-absorption and constant fixation with one's own image.
Yeah, and I find it like really, really interesting that you take us back into the 70s, and yeah, then it's so weird. I mean, you never saw, Polaroid turned into yourself, and it's really interesting what you're saying about this self-absorption and some kind of solipsism. But I feel as well that it's so far from actually knowing oneself, knowing yourself. It's just this kind of proliferation of images which are really not kind of true, as you mentioned yourself.
Yeah, but I think in the film there's kind of good. I think there's good narcissism and bad narcissism. I mean, there's certain kinds of narcissism that are necessary. This kind of Freudian idea of narcissism, which is that you in Freud's idea concept of narcissism, it's basically he's talking about infantile development and how initially the infant can't even tell, doesn't even distinguish itself or separate itself from the mother's breast, for example, or it doesn't recognize its own autonomy or its own independence. So, and as the child becomes older, they realize that they're a distinct person and that they have to develop their own self-identity, and that's a natural process of development. And also, the tagline for my movie is "Love Thyself," which is meant a little ironically, but it is true that one has to come to terms with oneself and accept oneself and kind of love oneself. So, and in terms of the film, like with the twins, Dominique and Daniel, they're both, their narcissism is justified in a way because they're beautiful, but in a classic sense. And I purposely cast a kind of actor with classical good looks, like cheekbones and all that, and kind of I think he has kind of a timeless look that almost could go back to Greek kind of times, ancient Greece. But so in that way, it's kind of like a justifiable narcissism. But he also, is missing his other half, and so, which is partly explains his fixation on his own image. And then when he finds the other half and kind of merges with it, then he becomes whole. Both of them do. And that's something that even non-twins can relate to. It's like sometimes you feel like there's something about you that is incomplete, or that needs to be completed. You might find that in another person, in like a lover, or you might find it just by reconciling kind of things in yourself that you've never made yourself whole. You have some kind of fragmented identity, or something that you've lost in yourself that you've never discovered. So and then the bad narcissism in the film, you might say, in some ways, is Beatrice, the mother, and the priest, the Father Andrew, who are both characters who are, in a sense, very self-absorbed, because it's they have these very strong desires, sexual desires, and they don't even quite recognize how acting on those desires negatively affect the people around them. You know, Irene says it was like witchcraft. Like she had she almost had it was as if she had a spell on me, and that she deliberately conjured me to take the place of, her mother, who was Beatrice's lesbian lover. So, but she doesn't quite understand, Beatrice, that replacing her lover with the lover's daughter might be, somewhat problematic for the daughter, because it raises all kinds of issues of symbolic incest and also just like using her for kind of her own selfish fulfillment of her own desires. And Father Andrew as well is totally self-absorbed, and he doesn't recognize or care that his manipulation of the boys, and in particular Daniel, is very traumatic for him. It's like a kind of sexual exploitation, and even though Daniel kind of falls in love with him, or has kind of fallen in love with him in a kind of Stockholm syndrome kind of way, it still has quite a negative effect on him.
Yeah, it was actually when you mentioned the mother, I wanted to ask, because I found this character so interesting in how you developed her. Like, she talks about art. It seems like she's really artsy person, and then this mysterious relation with the nature. So I found her like really, really interesting character.
She's kind of Wiccan in a way. She's kind of a witch. She is kind of a witch, I didn't spell it out too much, but she's, she takes hair from her son's brush, which you might imagine that she's using in some kind of incantation. She said she tried to summons him when he was lost to her, and so she does have, and this is contrasted to Father Andrew, who is like, that represents the church, institutionalized religion, Catholicism, where it's very rigid in some ways, and he's like a harsh disciplinarian, and his spirituality is kind of warped by this kind of homosexual repression that he has, and which he projects onto Saint Sebastian. So and he's kind of has a delusion that this boy that he's in love with, Daniel, is the reincarnation of Saint Sebastian. So the two are the even though they're both kind of problematic characters in a way, or with narcissistic characters, Beatrice is obviously a more sympathetic character. She's free, she's liberated, she's queer, she's living, autonomously, she's feminist, she smokes pot, she's liberal, and Father Andrew is like rigid, kind of what would you say? A kind of, sort of degenerate, although I'm not crazy about that word, but he's taking some kind of weird drug that could be like some kind of sex drug or something, chemsex in a way. So he's a much more malevolent kind of character.
Yeah, and you explored, or I mean, quite a lot, this sexuality and religion. It seems like you're bringing those two things, which, for most of the people is completely opposite and completely not brought together. Maybe you could talk a bit about this bringing together such, oppositions for most of the people, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's anything new. I mean, Pasolini was the master of that kind of synthesis of religious and sexual ecstasy. I mean, and the lives of Catholic saints are full of fetish and the most extreme kind of perversions, and S&M and you know, like self-abnegation, self-flagellation, um, you know, which is very sensual. Like you know, when Daniel is like masturbating to the catalog, the men's catalog, he's he's flagellating himself, which he takes pleasure in, obviously, but it's kind of a warped kind of perhaps expression of his sexuality, owing to the fact that Father Andrews has introduced him to S&M, you know, by piercing him with the arrows like Saint Sebastian on the Saint Andrew's cross, which has an obvious, you know, gay connotation. But yeah, I've been obsessed with this for a while. Like in 2012, I had a show in a photography show in Madrid in 2012 called at a gallery called La Fresh, called Obscenity, and it was very much about the intersection of sexual and religious ecstasy, and how at one point they kind of just become one and the same. You know, I love fetishists because they have a kind of spiritual devotion and kind of reverence for the object of their desire. Well, I always defend fetishists as, you know, they can have quite a spiritual dimension to what, even the, you know, foot worship, for example, is a sexual fetish, but it's kind of a real respect and devotion for the foot, and and um, so, and in that show, I used the ostia, the holy wafer, as not only a symbol of kind of censorship. I put the holy wafer over the subject's eyes and mouth, and but also on their erogenous zones and nipples and on their genitals, as a kind of fetish, sexual fetish, um, which really riled people up. I mean, the show was hugely controversial. The mayor of Madrid tried to close down the show. It was splashed all over the daily newspapers because I used high-profile models like Alaska and Rossi de Palma and others. So, and there was Christian protesters outside of the gallery, and then the day after the opening, somebody threw an explosive device through the front window of the gallery, which didn't go off. But the police were involved and everything. So it was a big spectacle, you know. And it was something that I didn't intend to be, you know, in terms of my work, the photographs were almost tame. I mean, they were suggestive more than, you know, explicit, and I didn't really intend them to be blasphemous per se. I mean, although there is a critique of the Catholic Church built in there because of, you know, the sexual exploitation of mostly, you know, boys has been a huge issue with the Catholic Church, and also their you know, that they don't support birth control and condoms and things like that, and don't acknowledge, and still obviously the Pope just declared that same-sex unions can't be blessed because they're not natural or whatever. I mean, did anyone really you know, was that very surprising? Did anyone really think that he was going to give them their blessing? But anyway, I'm fixated by that connection. Like I said, it's built into the lives of the saints. I'm not revealing anything new, but you know, it's also, you know, there's something about religious devotion that can be so passionate that it turns into kind of a sexual fetish.
And I wanted as well to say that I really like the ending of the film. I thought it's really sharp and perfect ending, and especially together with this song "Family Affair," yeah, by Sly and Family Stone. I thought it's such a nice, ironic, but at the same, like really hopeful ending of the film. Maybe you could comment a bit about the use of the song and the idea to end the film in such a way.
Yeah, we were lucky to get that song. My post-production team really did a great job doing that. But it came out about the same year as the film is set, 1972. So it does, not only does it evoke the period really well, but it's the lyric is surprisingly like literal in terms of its use with my movie. The song is about two sons that are born and raised differently, and how they all come together. The family coming together. So the whole ending. Someone actually suggested at one point that I cut out that ending and end with the death of Father Andrew, and I was like, oh my God, are you nuts? I mean, the ending is the kind of button on the film that kind of articulates my whole thesis, in the film, because what I'm talking about is, the film is partly about family romance, which is I'm tend to be pretty Freudian, and family romance was, Freud's concept, his theory that the nuclear family is such a tight unit, and are in such proximity, and you know the there's sexuality. He believed in child sexuality, and so that the child has sexual impulses, which is very controversial, but and the relation with the mother's breasts and the separation from the breast, and um, as I was mentioning. So I mean, but family romance was the acknowledgement that there are sexual tensions between members of the nuclear family, but there are social taboos, and there's a social contract in place to um, discourage those kinds of sexual relationships, for good reason. I mean, partly because of incest, because of inbreeding or whatever, and partly just because it would be an untenable scenario, kind of configuration, if everyone was having sex like within a family. It would just it's not something that can be that's that's practical, or that you even would want, because there's such a familial bond between people. Although there was a study that I was really interested in, where um, they took people who had been separated at birth from their members of their family, whether it be their mother, father, sister, brother, and people who are separated at birth and then reunited with their family members at a much later time, like when they're adults, tend to have a very strong sexual attraction to each other, because they are finally confronted with someone who they haven't been raised with, who they haven't had this social contract with, that it's taboo to have any sexual feelings for them, and yet this person seems like it's a kind of narcissistic attraction, where they see themselves in this person, and so and some of them do act on it, when they're reunited. I would say small percentage, but so that's what I'm kind of getting at. And rather than make people feel guilty and feel shame about these feelings, these sexual attraction between brother and sister, between brother and brother, whatever, the film is kind of more about how you know how to kind of reconcile these feelings. It's meant partly a bit tongue in cheek, like it's taken to a degree where the family is having an affair at the end, but it's complicated because the film is partly about twincest, and twincest was the original working title of the film. And if you think about sex between twins, it's kind of the most understandable form of incest, because it's like, say, between two brothers. If you have someone in your life who's an exact replica of you, and you're growing up and developing your sexuality the temptation would be, quite strong, I think, to have sexual contact with this person, because it's like the ultimate fulfillment of a narcissistic sexual drive. And in the gay world, there seems to be almost like two types of people who search for a partner that's exactly the opposite of them, or people who search for a partner that is the kind of almost identical to them, which we call this phenomenon twinnies, when you see two gay guys in a relationship who look exactly like each other. They dress the same, they both have beards, they both have, it's kind of a cliche, but the clone, and so that I find that very interesting. So, and then there's other symbolic incestuous kind of relationships in the film, like the relationship between Father Andrew and Daniel is the symbolic father having sex with the symbolic son, and Beatrice it's implied that she may have some kind of sexual relationship with Irene, who is the replacement of Irene's mother, her lover, but they're not related by blood, and so but she is the symbolic mother and acting mother, so she's like the mother and lover of Irene. So this is kind of complicates everything. Everything is all these relationships are kind of somewhat acceptable in the social contract, but in my version, of course, you tie it all up in a bow and make it like it's partly and make it kind of like hopeful and romantic, because it was also the time that the early 70s was a very kind of was about liberation. It was just at the beginning of gay liberation and female liberation, and so it's partly also about this notion of sexual freedom and openness and being liberated.
Yeah, so yeah, that's how I felt actually in the end. It's so seems like weird and kind of quirky, all of those relations, but there's this kind of hope of just being liberated and being with the ones you like truly love. It seems like this small gathering is about this kind of taking everything as it is and somehow just being quite happy about it finally.
Yeah, I mean, there is a
And
lot of shame and guilt is the worst thing that you can I mean, the way that you can deal with these kinds of issues, because and repression and really severe repression too, because as I always argue, if you repress something, especially a sexual desire or drive, it'll come back probably in a more monstrous kind of form, or it'll come back to kind of haunt you, or to or manifest itself in a negative way.
yeah, so thanks a lot, Bruce, for your time and your conversation. It was really interesting to talk with you.
My pleasure. I hope everyone enjoys the film, or has enjoyed the film.
Thank you.
Okay.
Ciao. Bye-bye.
Bye.
My grandmother's.
Right. So you do your grandmother's laundry. That's pretty sweet.
Well, normally she does the laundry.
So, not so sweet. You live with your grandmother?
Yeah? I take care of her.